By the evening of June 8th, the 101st Airborne Division had occupied a defensive arc on the southern flank of the 7th Corps. The 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment, after accomplishing its missions in the Foucarville area, had taken positions on the right flank of the division, from Cherbourg to the vicinity of Saint-Côme-du-Mont. The 327th Glider Infantry Regiment relieved Colonel Johnson's and Captain Shettle's men in the vicinity of the Lock and the La Porte bridges. The 506th held the center, astride the Carentan highway, while the 501st was assembled near Verville as a division reserve. The plan of the 101st Airborne provided for 2 crossings of the Douve. The left wing, starting at 0100 on June 10, was to cross the vicinity of Brevand. Part of this force was to join the 5th Corps near the Vert River Bridge, while the main force was to drive southwest to seize Carentan. The right wing was to cross the causeway, bypass Carentan, and seize Hill 30, southwest of the city. Capture of Hill 30 would put the Americans astride the principal German escape route from Carentan. There were indications that Carentan was not heavily defended. Airplane reconnaissance reported that Carentan had been evacuated and that also a big gap had been blown in the railway embankment, thus making the causeway the only practical approach to the city. Straight and narrow, the causeway rises some 6 to 9 feet above the marshes and spans Douve and the Madeleine rivers and the 2 Douve canals. Any attack would thus expose the infantry to fire from the front and both flanks. On either side, the marshes extend out of rifle range, with the western bank of the causeway falling away sharply to the water's edge. Only the more gradually sloping eastern bank offered an opportunity to dig in. The attack was to be carried out by Colonel Cole's 3rd Battalion on early June 10, but the inability of the engineers working under fire to repair Bridge No. 2 postponed the attack. The battalion was then told that the attack would be launched in the afternoon, with considerable artillery support. Most of the artillery fire was laid on suspected and known enemy positions southwest of Bridge No. 4. At noon, the engineers had still not spanned the 12-foot gap at the second bridge, but Colonel Cole and 3 other men improvised a footbridge with engineer planking, enabling the battalion to start crossing in single file. The men moved low or crawled along the embankment. After 3 hours, most of them were beyond the second bridge, and the point of the battalion had crossed the 3rd bridge when the enemy opened fire from the hedgerows and a large farmhouse to the right front. The men in the point hit the ditches. As they attempted to move forward, an enemy machine gun behind a hedgerow only 100 yards away searched the ditches, and after 3 men were hit, the group withdrew. The battalion extended in a long, thin column on the road and was unable to maneuver to either flank. To advance, it had to send 1 man at a time to rush the Belgian gate at Bridge No. 4 and slip through the narrow opening under direct enemy fire. This would have been impossible without artillery support, which undoubtedly reduced the effectiveness of enemy fire. Part of G Company, which was leading the battalion, deployed to the left of the 4th bridge, while the rest of the company tried to cross the bridge through the narrow opening.
You want to live? You better suck it in and squeeze through that gate!
Six men edged through. The 7th was hit, and the company stopped to build up a fire position. Company I, exposed on the right bank near the 3rd bridge where the men had no grass for concealment and could not dig in, was hit hard. First by enemy rifle fire and later by 2 planes that bombed and strafed its positions.
The Sola! Hurry up and go!
The strafing in particular took a heavy toll, and when it was over, part of the company moved back behind Bridge No. 2. About midnight, during a lull in the firing, Company H started moving men through the Belgian gate at Bridge No. 4, At 0400 on June 11th, the battalion was ordered to continue the attack, and in the darkness, Company G and Headquarters Company followed Company H across the 4th Bridge. Most of the enemy troops appeared to be concentrated in and around the farmhouse to the southwest. When leading scouts on the right approached the farmhouse, they were fired on by rifles, machine guns, and mortars. In an attempt to neutralize the position, an artillery concentration was placed on the area but had no perceptible effect. Colonel Cole then ordered a bayonet charge on the farmhouse and called across the road to Major Stopka, the battalion executive officer, to have the order passed along. Artillery put down smoke in a wide arc around the objective. At 06:15, the artillery fire was lifted. Colonel Cole blew his whistle and led the charge. Of the 250 men who should have followed him, only 20 got up to go. Another 50 followed Major Stopka. In the confusion and excitement, with the men widely distributed, the order had not been passed around. Some of the men never received it. Others only had a vague idea by hearing a word or two. In addition, parts of Company G in the meadow east of the road to Carentan became involved with enemy troops armed with machine pistols. Most of the men of Company G did not hear the whistle at all, but when they saw the attack, they ran after the others, trying to catch up. Despite the initial disorder, the men charged across a ditch into the fire-swept field east of the farmhouse. 2 men of Company H reached the farmhouse first and found it abandoned, but to the west, on higher ground, the enemy still occupied rifle pits and machine gun emplacements along a hedgerow running at right angles to the road. Under the momentum of the charge, Cole's men secured the hedgerow as well. The enemy's main defense was thus broken, but he still held ground to the south, from which they continued to fire on the American positions. Colonel Cole wished to take advantage of the enemy's disorganization and keep the attack moving, but the 3rd Battalion was in no condition to push on. All of the men in the battalion managed to cross the causeway and assemble near the farmhouse, but units were badly mixed and suffered heavy casualties. Word was therefore sent to the rear to ask Colonel Cassidy and his 1st Battalion to come up and pass through the 3rd and continue the attack south to reach Hill 30. The 1st Battalion was north of Bridge 4 when it received Cole's message. It crossed the bridge under fire and deployed across the fields towards the farmhouse. Instead of relieving the 3rd Battalion, however, it reinforced it to help secure the ground gained. The 1st Battalion had already been hit hard, especially by mortar fire, and was disorganized as the 3rd. Colonel Cole commanded the positions on the right from his command post in the farmhouse, and Colonel Cassidy stayed on the left. There was little communication between them. On the right flank, the defensive positions were improved when 3 machine gun teams set up their guns in the farmhouse and at the crossroads southwest of it. With their backs against the river, the troops had no rear and hence no local reserve. The artillery observers could not see where their shells were landing because of the hedgerows and had to adjust fire, in the manner of jungle warfare, by sound. In the middle of the morning, artillery and mortar fire increased in intensity, and the Germans began a counterattack. One of the strongest thrusts came through the orchard and threatened to rout the Americans south and east of the farmhouse, but the machine guns that had been set up earlier broke up the attack and the position was restored. Shortly before noon, an unexplained lull occurred in the fighting. The 502nd Regiment took advantage of this to reform its left flank positions. The next German attack strained the American positions almost to the breaking point. The group at the crossroads managed to hold only with the support of one of the machine gun teams in the farmhouse. The positions on the left held through the afternoon against repeated German attempts to come down the ditches besides the highway and along the hedgerows. At times, the Germans came so near that the Americans could hear them working their bolts. Colonel Cole, looking out from a second-story window in the farmhouse, expected his line to crack. At 18:30 hours, he informed the regiment that he planned to withdraw and asked to have covering fire and smoke ready when the time came. He believed that only closer and heavier artillery support would enable him to hold out, but the radio of his artillery liaison officer, Captain Julian Rosemont, had been jammed. When Captain Rosemont finally managed to get through to the artillery command post, the situation improved rapidly. To be effective, it was necessary to adjust the artillery fire very closely, which resulted in 2 Americans killed by friendly fire. The shells arced high over the American positions and fell in the field directly beyond the farmhouse. It lasted only 5 minutes, but when the fire lifted, the sound of German firing was receded southwards. Patrols ascertained that the enemy had fled. At about 2000 hours, the 2nd Battalion came up to take over the now improved positions, and the 1st and 3rd Battalions withdrew. The enemy defense barring the way to Carentan from the north was broken, but the 502nd Parachute Infantry Regiment was too exhausted to continue the attack. It requested relief, and the 506th Regiment was sent to finish the job.